Hello everyone. So today's in this session we are going to learn about context API. So here I create an empty React Native project to demonstrate the context API, how it's work. So first part in this video we are going to learn the theoretical concept that we need to know, and later on we will create a counter app to demonstrate how context API works. So our main goal is not to create a counter app. Our main goal is to know how context API work. Okay. So here I create a scenario. So this scenario explain us why we need context API. So what will happen if we create a project without context API? So we assume that we have a parent component. So inside this parent component we have another three component called navbar, home and about, right? So inside navbar we have another component child, and inside child we have another component called child v. So now we need to pass data from parent component to child b component. So those who are know about props, they will say that we pass a props to navbar component, and then we pass a prop to child component, child a component, and then we pass that prop child v component. But here navbar and child a component receive prop, but these two components don't need that data, right? So they are receiving just because of they need to pass that data to child b component. So these things is known as prop drilling. So avoid this prop drilling, we use context API. So our main goal is to pass data. Data means state functions, right? So our main goal is to pass data from parent component to child component without passing any props. So we don't pass any props, but still child b component, this component can access data from this parent component, right? So how this child v component will access parent component data? Because of context API. So we assume that this parent component hold some state, some function, and then our main goal is to child v component, so that child v component can access that parent state and functions without passing any props, just with the help of context. So this is the main things we need context. So here in this coding part, so this is an empty React Native project just showing a text in our UI part, hello one. So this is nothing, this is our main app component. So I just close this app component. So now the main things are going on. So we create a src folder. Okay, we are going to be create a source folder called src. Inside src we are going to create another folder called components, and inside components we are going to create another folder called context, and inside context I am going to create a file called counter context. .jsx, it's a JSX file. So here in this counter context file I am going to create a context for counter, right? So that's why we need to import use context hook create context hook, and obviously we need to import React from React. So first of all, we import React from React, and also we need to import create context and use context and use state, because we have state value. That's why we need to import this. And after that, our main goal is to create a context for counter context. So we create a variable called counter context. So it's just a variable. So some of us thought that it's a topic or something like that. It's just a variable. So you can create context for any variable, any topics. Okay. So what we need to do for create context for counter, we just called create context hook. Here we just call create context. So now we need to create a provider function for that counter context. So what is basically the provider function? So you can assume that it's a container that holds some state and some function, and later on we can pass this provider so that other components can access data from this provider without passing any props, right? So here I'm going to create a function. We are going to create a function called counter provider. So it's a default. You can export default. Function name will be function keyword. Also, this function name will be counter provider. So we create a counter provider. So obviously we create a counter provider, so it receives a children object as props, and let's return something fragment, empty fragment. Okay, so it will return that children, right? So here we create counter context dot provider, right? So inside this we need to pass children, that children. Okay, so we are going to format this document. So basically what we are doing so far, we are create a context for counter context and then create a provider function for this counter context. So inside provider functions we just provide these children, and this counter provider functions can hold some state. So here I'm going to create a state. So let state it takes array, so count, and this second parameter will be function set count, and use state. The initial value for state is assume that 50. Okay, so here we create a state. So it's a variable. We create a use state. First parameter is a variable, second parameter it's a function. So initial value for this count variable is 50, right? And here we have another two data, function. So const, here we create two functions, const increment, so it's we take it as a callback function. So what will happen whenever we call this increment function, it's just call set count method and increment the variable. So it's increment the count variable plus plus. Okay, later we have another function. So another function decrement and count minus minus, just copy and paste. So now in this counter provide, it's a container, so it's hold data. So here it's hold three data, one state, it's a variable, one state variable, so and two functions, so it's hold three data. Now I need to pass this three data, so here I will pass, we pass this three data. So we can write value and it's an object, so we pass these three data as object. So first we pass count variable, and then we pass these two functions, right? Increment and decrement. Okay, displace. Format, we are going to format. So what will happen here, we create a context, into a counter context variable, and then we create a function counter provider. That function, this function hold three data, one state and two functions, and later on we are going to pass this three data rep to a counter context provider, right? So now we need to export another function, export function, where we need to use context. So this use context is function name, it's just a name. So another components, if other components need to access data, these three data, then that component just import this use context functions and then access this data. So that we need to return or pass our context. So return use context, we import here use context. So inside use context hook, we need to just pass our context for counter. So we just pass this. Okay, so now here we create a context that hold three data, and later on we pass that context. So if any component, just import this function, and then that component have access these three variables. So for that I just to create another component that have access from, that will show data from this component's data, right? So here I create another component called display display.jsx. So here I use shortcut, so React Native functional expression, expression function create করবে এটা। So এখানে just click করলেই হচ্ছে they will provide a structure, right? Just a basic structure. Display. Okay. display. So spelling mistake, sorry, rename dis display take us. Okay, so here we need to import, just here we need to import that use context, right? So import use context from, no, I need to import this use context, no, use counter, COUNTER, counter. Okay, so here we need to import use counter. Use counter from counter context. Okay, so we import. Now our main task is to destructure that data from use counter. So here we create a const destructure that data. So we destructure count variable, then to function increment, and another function decrement from from use counter. So basically what happened here, what will happen here, we just import use counter function from counter context, right? So we create use counter function from this, so it's return these three data, and then we destructure that three data from use counter. So any component can just import use counter and then they can use it in their component. So here we need to just create a text. So here I just initial value is JSX. We need JavaScript, so here we pass this variable. So we pass this count variable. So whenever you use curly braces, it's mean JavaScript. Yes, and then we need button. Yes, two button for, so button component, it's a built-in React Native component. We need a button. The title attribute will be increment. On press, this function will be invoked, right? So we need another button for decrement operation. Title will be decrement and the function invoke pressing decrement. So we need to wrap these two buttons into our view component so that we can make a basic style for these two components. Okay. Okay. So here we just display this, we just finish our component. So here we create a style, STYL style. So here we use inline styling. So we just create an inline styling cap 10, and we are going to be margin 10, so margin 10. Font size 21. Font weight. So in our main app.jsx file, we are going to import our display data. Display from this, and we also need to import context provider. Context provider from this, and then we need to wrap our context provider so that every component can access this data. Inside this view component, we pass our component called Ctrl Z, Ctrl X, counter display component. We pass display component. So this is our application. So what will happen, this display component just import use counter function, use counter function, and that function returns object, these three object, and then import this into, and then we destructure these three data from use counter function, and then later on we use in this component. So here we don't pass any props, so counter context don't pass any props, it just pass a context. So any other component have access to this three data from counter context. And in my virtual emulator I face some issues, so that's why I build this app in my phone. So here we see that three data. So one is initial context value that is 50, and then we have two button that was basically two functions, so increment and decrement. If I click increment, then value will be increased, and if I press decrement button, the value will be decreased. So here these two function and that state value comes through context API. So here we don't pass any props, we just import use counter, so that that returns our context. So and then we destructure that value and use inside a local component. So this is all about. So basically the main concept is we need to pass data by props, but with the help of context we don't need to pass, we just import function and then destructure that data from function, and then we can use our component. So that's all.